For as popular as the Republic gunship is, I've always found it strange that a direct successor to this vehicle in both form and function is nowhere to be found in the Imperial arsenal. We see vehicles that purport to fill this role, and we also see a continued use of Clone Wars era law enforcement transports, but we see nothing that directly parallels for the Empire what the original low-altitude assault transport embodied for the Republic. This is how I imagine an Imperial successor to the Republic gunship would look. While in our world, the original gunship was designed with details and shapes evoking the traditional language of the Star Wars good guys, the Imperial version of the gunship ought to embody the cold, sharp military indifference of the Empire. Now, we haven't seen much of flying Imperial ground attack vehicles, so there really isn't a strong precedent for how such a machine ought to look, but it felt proper to me that a vehicle that occupies the niche between space and ground ought to be a crossbreed of both Imperial walkers and Imperial starships. So consequently, my Imperial gunship draws on the AT-ST and ships in the TIE line, as well as the Lambda shuttle, while still retaining the core configuration of the original Republic gunship. This new gunship has a much larger wingspan to literally cast a bigger shadow on all who would oppose it. But overall, the design is a bit more compact than the Republic gunship, using space a bit more efficiently. In concept artwork for Attack of the Clones, we can see that the Republic gunship was originally designed at a much smaller size and was later scaled up, leading to oversized doors and a lot of empty space in the troop bay. So by lowering the ceiling to a more sensible height, I basically get a troop bay with a similar floor space, but now I have tons of extra space above for additional troops, supplies, or specialized mission equipment, especially after saving space by combining the double cockpits into a single two-seat cockpit. This is why you'll find upper doors on my Imperial gunship, which allow the personnel within to exit directly to the exterior without having to pass through the main hold. I've also taken advantage of the more massive wing sections to move the light vehicle storage from the rear of the vehicle to compartments under the wings. This gave me space to include a bulkhead in the troop bay, allowing for the aft section to double as an airlock for troop deployments in vacuum or hostile atmospheres, without simultaneously exposing the entire troop bay. This is paired with the Imperial gunship's expanded capacity to operate in space. While it would still be considered a combat airspeeder and not a proper spaceship, my Imperial gunship would be capable of achieving orbit on its own power, so it can both deploy from and return to a mothership in orbit. So where would this Imperial gunship fit into the broader Star Wars universe? Well, of course I would come up with a bit of backstory for it, so here goes. As the Empire took control, the edict was given that every symbol of the Republic had to be retired or redesigned for the new era. This particularly included prominent Republic military vehicles, such as the so-called Republic gunship, which despite the massive cost in scrapping them and commissioning new vehicles, it was considered an acceptable loss in the greater goal of projecting the image of an all-powerful empire that inherited nothing from the old corrupt order. Like the rest of the Empire's frontline ground attack vehicles, the Imperial successor to the Republic gunship would be developed directly by LAAT Drive Yards, which somewhat controversially restyled the vehicle to have a design and many components in common with its AT line walkers. Thus, the LAAG was born, the Low Altitude Assault Gunship. LAAT Drive Yards operated under the assumption of utter Imperial air supremacy in all possible use cases, so these new gunships no longer needed to be as nimble as the Republic predecessors, and were thus designed with robust armor that was uncharacteristically heavy for an aerial vehicle. LAAT argued that these gunships would be penetrating and subduing deeply entrenched insurgent forces, not engaging structured military forces with proper air support, so air defense systems were largely ignored in favor of heavier underside armor and heavier ground targeting weaponry derived from LAAT's AT line walkers. That being said, the LAAG wasn't particularly helpless in aerial combat and could launch air-to-air weapons from launcher modules developed in close cooperation with Scianar. This collaboration simplified supply logistics by ensuring that all Imperial flying vehicles, regardless of manufacturer, were compatible with the same weaponry, and the self-contained nature of these modules meant that even conscripted local ground crews unfamiliar with Imperial ordnance could effectively arm Imperial vehicles. Additional aerial defenses on the gunship included a turreted rear laser cannon to fend off pursuit. Despite this feature, this gunship was considered somewhat easily overpowered from behind and from above, but that was only in the fleetingly unlikely chance that enemies of the Empire would have sufficient command of the airspace to do so. The LAAG was also equipped with 2 wingtip composite beam laser dishes. While highly destructive and a potent force of psychological warfare, these weapons were not without their problems. The composite beam dishes of the Republic gunship had been mounted in sealed spherical housings, but to maximize the power output in the same amount of space, the Imperial version would significantly scale up the emitter dishes at the cost of the protective housing. This exposed the relatively delicate components to undue wear. Coupled with finicky mechanical articulation, the composite beam lasers were prone to failure and were consequently used somewhat sparingly. Quad drive yards would also develop specialized variants of the LA line, including the low-altitude combat hauler, which could carry supplies and light combat vehicles directly into a war zone. Much smaller than the armor carriers of the Clone Wars, these new combat haulers couldn't handle anything much larger than a scout walker, but could still carry about 6 troops and supplies in addition to combat vehicles, allowing the LACH to theoretically deploy a fully supplied squad of troops with armor support all in a single landing. The original low-altitude assault transport had been an indispensable staple of the Republic's combat strategy during the Clone Wars, and Quad had hoped to sell a high volume of these new gunships to the Empire. But the Empire consistently maintained that strategies involving the tactical insertion and extraction of troops were only employed from a position of weakness, and were ultimately unfitting for displays of Imperial power. The idea was to stop rebellion from starting in the first place through raw intimidation, not to engage with them in protracted combat on their own terms. This combat philosophy meant that relatively few of these new gunships would see service, and even fewer would see frontline combat, as most were deployed in second or even third waves, or entirely after the engagement to mop up and perform search and rescue operations. Because of this, the LAAG was often manned by the standard infantry corps of the Imperial Army, rarely having the honor of serving the Empire's elite stormtroopers. As the infantry were generally associated with low-risk peacekeeping on far-flung worlds, the LAAG eventually earned a reputation as the sort of vehicle that was used only to carry cargo and unfortunate personnel around desolate outposts at the fringes of the galaxy. This, of course, ignored the gunship's incredible potential and the fact that many of these gunships would actually be found in the opposite context, in densely urbanized core worlds, where it was considered infeasible to deploy vehicles like walkers, which were the Empire's more favored weapons of intimidation. But when it came to air and space supremacy, the Empire focused heavily on the production of enormous capital ships and in producing overwhelming numbers of disposable fighters. They ultimately neglected the middle ground of tactically robust vehicles designed for flexibility and survivability. This left little room in the Imperial arsenal for a genuine successor to the Republic gunship, which was a type of vehicle that would largely remain a product of the past. So that's the story of my Imperial gunship. It was a long process, but a ton of fun figuring out how to give this ship a unique identity while still retaining what made the original Republic gunship so special in the first place. Between designing, modeling, scene setting, rendering, animating, composing, and editing, these videos are an enormous undertaking featuring the collaborative work of multiple artists. If you like the work that we do here on this channel and you want to help ensure that we continue to have the flexibility to produce these videos, please support us on Patreon. But really, I'd like to thank each and every one of you for watching until the end, and I hope to see you next time.